What's up, everybody? This is Chris from Brooklyn Wildlife, and you are watching Just for My People, an interview series with various creatives, writers, thinkers, and all around awesome folks. Today, our special guest is
Jessie Sage.
awesome. All right, and so we're bringing on Jessie. You are a writer, a advocate, and an educator of sorts. So, can you tell people a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I am a writer. I write a weekly sex column in Pittsburgh. I also am a freelance writer that works mostly on issues of sex work and sexuality and feminism. I also host a weekly podcast, or it's been on hiatus, but it's coming back, called the Peep Show podcast, that it brings news and stories from the sex industry, and I do all of that as a sex worker.
And so, how did you get into writing in the first place, and how do you merge these two worlds?
That's a funny story. So I was an academic. I dropped out of a PhD program. So I was writing on feminism, and I was in a philosophy program. I was doing philosophy, and I have a background in theology as well. And I was writing academic stuff on sexuality and embodiment within philosophy, but that was a really bad fit for a lot of reasons. And so I left my program. And when I left my program, I didn't write at all for a while. Like I kind of needed to purge a lot of, academia out of my life and out of my head. And I started working as a doula in that time and doing childbirths. And out of that, because I couldn't, make ends meet being a doula, I started working doing camming and sex camming. And then I got into phone sex and online, other sort of like online sex work. And after I was doing that for a couple of years, I just started to write about the experiences that I was having. And somehow that kind of accidentally turned into a writing career that I didn't really anticipate or expect. So I was mostly just writing about my experiences, and it turned into more of a full-time thing for me.
Wow. And so, for people that don't know, and these definitions are somewhat fluid, like most
Mhm.
language, how would you even define sex work?
Yeah, so sex work is an umbrella term that encompasses erotic services for money or trade. So, under sex work is a lot of different sorts of work. So, stripping, being a phone sex operator, doing porn, doing cam work, doing escort work, doing street based prostitution, all of those fall under sex work. So I would define sex work as trading erotic services for money or other goods.
And as a writer, do people find it to be either paradoxical or somehow in conflict that you are writing about feminism but also sex work?
No, and people ask me that question a lot. And I think that part of the reason that I get asked that question is because there's been such a backlash from feminists, particularly from second wave feminists, about sex work and in all of its forms. So um, I think that part of my work and what I was trying to do when I started off was to push back against those feminist narratives that sex work is like altogether degrading or problematic for women, or that women shouldn't participate in it, or that it's somehow bowing to like the patriarchy or to patriarchal norms of what women should be. And what I found when I entered the sex industry is that those sort of narratives that were imposed on sex workers from outside of the sex work community didn't really reflect the experiences that most of the sex workers that I know have within the industry. So a lot of people enter into sex work for all sorts of reasons. And many of the people that I was encountering within the sex industry, and also coming out of like my own experiences, was that they were doing it because they thought that it was the best choice out of all the given other choices that they had. And so a lot of while while some people are coerced into sex work, or while people do it out of necessity, there are also a lot of women and people of all genders who choose to go into sex work because they like it, or because it's better paying for their circumstances, or because it's more flexible than other sorts of work, or because they just enjoy the work that they're doing. So, I don't think that you have to like sex work for it to be a good option for you. People enter into all kinds of work that they don't like. But I also think that there are a lot of people who get a lot out of the work that they're doing. Yeah. So when people ask me if it's in conflict with feminism, I do not think it's in conflict with feminism. I think that you can be a feminist and a sex worker. And I think that most of the sex workers that I know, you know, gain some sort of like power out of the work that they're doing. And
Well,
I
so
also,
you bring
I
up,
also want to say, like, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead. You can ask a question.
yeah, what were you going to say?
No, I was going to say, I also think that there's a problem with women and under the umbrella of like feminism policing the work and the choices of other women.
Yeah, and so I guess you bring up a couple of issues, and the idea of workers' rights and the
Mhm.
idea of how many people aren't in some way dissatisfied with elements of the profession they're in. And this
Right.
idea
Yeah.
that we're supposed to all love everything about what we do. And it's
Mhm.
almost like a double standard applied to sex work, as well as this idea of and something I've come across is you have men that are able to use their bodies, whether it's playing sports, whether it's construction,
Yeah.
whether you're doing whatever else, and it's clearly can be detrimental to their health, or there can be negative repercussions to
Right.
that, and no one really bats an eye. And in a way, it's supported as a totally legitimate job, and
Right.
that's not that leeway isn't given to sex workers. How do you approach that discussion? Are you able to find a way to communicate with folks who may start out in opposition so that they see this as legitimate opportunity for folks, or is it really like you're kind of preaching to the choir?
Yeah, I think it's both. So, I mean, I think that the point that you bring up is really important because sex workers get held to this standard that I think other professions don't get held to. We're supposed to say that we love our job all the time in order for it to be legitimate. And I think that that does a couple of things. It silences the voices of sex workers who feel like they can't talk about like the nuance of their jobs without anything that's not wholly positive being used against them for why they shouldn't be doing the work that they're doing. And I think that that's really problematic. But yeah, where other people in other professions are allowed to say that there are days that they don't like, or things that they don't like, or bosses that they don't like, or, any number of things. And those bits of information or the story of the profession as a whole don't get used against them in the way that they get used against sex workers. Um, I think that you bring up an important point, which is that like people who work in the profession, people who are sex workers understand that, and we have networks to talk to each other about that. But there is kind of an echo chamber, I think, in the sense that most of the people who understand that are already on the side of sex workers, and people who don't understand that aren't. And it is hard to kind of bridge that gap. And that's one of the things that I try to do with my work. I mean, in terms of writing and podcasting, trying to get an audience that goes outside of just the sex work community, because I think it's important for other people, for non-sex workers, to be able to humanize sex workers and see them as people who are deserving of rights within their job, regardless of why they're there.
Yeah, it's something I've been trying to do with this interview series is bridge the gap between the arts community that I'm a part of
Mhm.
and the audience that normally listens to art, and then the reality of in working in nightlife and in bars and clubs for the past 12 or 15 years. A lot of the folks I work with at different points have been strippers, have been
Yeah.
escorts, have been involved, in various layers or levels of
Mhm.
sex work, and of all genders, of all expressions. And it seems to be this place where intersectionality is on the forefront, and an
Yeah.
awareness of intersectionality is on the forefront. And so I think there are some valuable discussions to be had. But there is this thing of some of the conversations, if I were to speak to you and I ask you certain things, you'd be like, yo, this is really basic. Like people should already have done their own research. Why are you asking this type of simple question? On
Uh-huh.
the other hand, if we jump in super deep, I know there are people that haven't had this discussion. There are people that
Right.
aren't aware of the overlap of migrant worker issues and sex
Sure.
work, or the overlap of the trans rights issues and sex workers, and the safety issues, and
Right.
like this idea of, in a way, I'm stuck at the point of still trying to humanize
Yeah.
uh, humans, and that's kind of like, why should we have to do that?
Yeah.
You
Mhm.
know.
No,
So in
and
your
I think
writing,
that's why it's good that you, like, asked at the beginning, like, what are we even talking about when we're talking about sex workers? Because people don't necessarily know that.
yeah. And so in your writing, what are some of the ways that you're able to bridge that gap, or how do you then reach out to folks who may not be quite aware of the
Mhm.
subject, but also not kind of have a circular conversation?
Yeah, I think storytelling is really powerful, and I think that you can only make so many arguments. I think you can only make so many arguments and have those be effective. It's hard to change people's mind with arguments or with facts or with statistics. I think that we're more likely to be successful if, in humanizing sex work and sex workers if we um, through telling our own stories, through being it's actually I'm as I'm saying this, I mean, I think that's one of the things that I've done in my work is talk to a lot of sex workers, share their stories, share the story, even with stories of clients. I mean, I think it's important to talk about clients and to humanize clients because one of the things that one of the misconceptions about like sex workers is that clients are always, terrible and abusive, and that's not true. Not all clients are terrible and abusive. So I think even talking about what do those relationships look like, and what kind of relationships are transactional relationships, how do they change, how do a lot of them look like regular relationships or long-term relationships, even though they're in this sort of uh sex work context. So I think telling the stories of sex workers, telling the stories of their clients, in a way that is normalizing and humanizing, is really important. I mean, I think that it's hard though because sex workers are also really vulnerable. So,
Mm.
you want to be able to do that in a way that also respects like the privacy of sex workers or doesn't put them in further danger. So, it's the thing I think that's difficult about that is that this means that really you can only tell the stories of people who have a degree of privilege or who are somewhat safe or who are already out or who feel comfortable talking about the work that they do, and not everybody does. So I think storytelling is important, but I also think that within the context of sex work it can be something that has to be done with a degree of care.
Yeah, and so being really transparent, something I run into with these interviews is I'm afraid to ask about certain things because I don't want to a kind of fetishize a
Mhm.
lifestyle or occupational choice, and I don't want it to be this kind of salacious.
Yeah.
What kind
Mhm.
of thing can I dig up as like a that's so fantastical that people attach to watch? And
Right.
on the other hand, there's like things I kind of may not then be excavating that could be informative for people,
Right. Yeah.
and trying
Mhm.
to learn the boundaries, or learning what's a reasonable level of depth to go, because it's literally, if you engage in things that are illegal, talking about it on the internet can be problematic
Right,
depending on
right.
what the situation is,
Yeah.
you know.
Mhm. Yeah, and
um
I mean, I think that's one of the things I was trying to get at is that, like, I think this is really important, like, being able to talk about the professions that we have, being able to talk about what that looks like, and normalize that for people, I think is really important, but there are a lot of risks to that, and I think that we need to be, like, we need to take seriously, like, what those risks are and how, um, y and I think that the way that you're like, talking about that is important, but I also think that, I don't know, people can decide, like, how to tell their stories and what they feel comfortable telling. I also think it's important not to assume that, you know, anybody knows better than somebody else, like what's good for them or what stories they should or shouldn't tell.
Yeah. So as a storyteller and with your podcast, what are some of the either subjects you've brought up? Who are, I guess, some of the folks you brought on? What were you trying to convey or work through in your podcast?
Yeah, so I run my podcast with my partner. We co-host it together, and we started it off just wanting to bring on. We knew so many people, I think, kind of similar to what you were doing. We knew a lot of people who are working in the sex industry or adjacent to the sex industry who were doing really interesting work, and wanted to talk to them about what that looks like. And so we have kind of a broad range. So we've brought on sex workers. Obviously, that's probably the core of who we have on, but that includes a lot. We've had porn stars on, like Stoya and Lorelei Lee, and like bigger like porn stars have been on. We've also had reporters who report on, the journalists who write on the sex industry, like EJ Dixon and Samantha Cole from Vice. We've had like uh cam models like Lydia Love, and just I'm trying to, we've done 50 episodes, so I'm trying to like
Oh
go
wow,
through and
okay.
like think about who's been on the show. But yeah, it's been a mix of writers who write about the sex industry, cam performers, people who have done escorting, like strippers. We've done some and then artists and burlesque performers and people who are adjacent to, and the main goal is to talk about and to humanize and to normalize like who are the people who are doing this work, because the fact of the matter is that people interact and brush up with sex workers all the time. People watch porn, and people also know people who are sex workers, even if they don't know that they know sex workers. And so I think kind of bringing those conversations to the forefront and talking to them about what sort of work are they doing and what sort of struggles do they have with it, is what we're doing with the show.
Yeah, one of the things that's also come out of these conversations are, because of the criminalization around sex work, the kind of safety issues or the ability to have some of these conversations and to be taken seriously. So, like, a friend of mine was in a play with Stoya,
Mm-hmm.
and her story like was pretty well known in the sense of her the issue she had, and when she tried to present the issue she had with like another performer or
Mm-hmm.
worker, people were like, "Well, you're in the industry. Basically, whatever happens to you is on you." Or
Yeah.
this idea of, if you decide to engage in certain activities, if things go wrong, you've already kind of abdicated yourself from having recourse. And so how do we engage in that conversation of, yes, even though we know some of these activities are fringe or taboo or in some cases illegal, still protect the people?
Right, right. Yeah, because if you sign up to, shoot a scene, or you sign up for, an encounter of whatever sort, like that doesn't mean that you sign up to be hurt or to be assaulted or to be brutalized. Like those, we can't. I think that's really problematic when people say that. There's like, we have to talk about like what it is that sex workers agree to and consent to, and what they don't consent to, and to assume that sex workers lose like consent because they agree to one form of activity, is a really troubled notion of what like consent is and what it is that sex workers are doing.
And are you finding that there are advocacy groups in this arena or organizations that are able to advocate?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of sex work organizations. Yeah, I mean, SWAP is one of them, the Sex Worker Outreach Projects. Liz Estrada, the SWAP Behind Bars, does a lot of good work for incarcerated sex workers.
Wait, you know Liz Estrada?
What?
You know about that? You know that organization, Liz Estrada?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's my homie. That's
Oh,
one of the
yeah.
first people I interviewed. Yeah, that's so cool.
Nice.
All right. Sorry, I
Yeah.
didn't mean to cut you off. Go
No,
ahead.
no, no. Yeah, there's a lot of organizations who are working to working. One of the things I think that's important to talk about is that other sorts of other organizations aren't there for sex workers. So sex workers need to create that on their own. So there's a lot of grassroots like organizations and a lot of community building organizations like within sex work itself, to help sex workers, because other groups aren't doing that, and the government isn't doing that. And so yeah, there is. I think we saw that a lot with COVID. So because sex workers aren't able to apply for small business loans, the same sort of small business loans that other independent contractors and small businesses were able to apply for. Sex worker organizations set up their own relief funds. And there's
Right.
many of them who set up relief funds for sex workers who needed help, because people who were doing primarily or exclusively in-person work weren't able to do their work anymore. Um, so yeah, there's a lot of organizing within sex work.
Wait, you just froze out. You said you just froze out when you
Okay.
said people that were doing primarily, and then you went blank.
Oh, yeah, people who were doing primarily or
So,
or exclusively in-person work needed to can't no longer were able to work with their clients in the same way. So yeah, a lot of those people who lost their income, you know, all of it or much of it, those relief funds are set up for that.
yeah, and so prior to COVID and the shelter in place, you have already somewhat established some online platforms, like in the sense of having your podcast or being able to do your writing. For folks who were doing in person, or even if it's dancing or if it's
Yeah,
escorting or whatever it might
right.
be, what options did they have to now still pull in income?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a lot of people are trying to pivot to online work. So meaning setting up OnlyFans accounts, moving their business and their interactions with clients to Skype and other platforms like Night Flirt and Sex Panther and the platforms that we work on. Yeah, so there's been a lot of people who are doing primarily in-person work who've been trying to transition and pull their clients into online work. And then there's been, and you're right. For me, I was already doing that. I already have set up an OnlyFans. I already have a Night Flirt account for phone sex. I have these things set in place. So a lot of the people who were doing online work were already set up for that. There's For the people who weren't set up for that, there are a lot of people who are figuring it out as they go along. But I also know that there's like support networks to help like smooth those transitions. And so I've seen a lot of that taking place too. So how do you pivot your business from being primarily in person to online? What do these platforms look like? How are people cross promoting each other? Because there's a lot of cross promotion, particularly with OnlyFans, which has become one of the primary ways that people are making money right now. A lot of cross promotional networks that are rising up in this time more than they were before. So there's that. There's a lot of people who've been doing a lot of online work who are setting up webinars and other sorts of educational things for people who are trying to transition their business. It's been interesting to watch all of this because while business is up in some ways, it's also more complicated right now. So, for several different reasons.
I mean, would you be able to go into that a little bit?
Yeah, yeah. It's complicated for a couple of different reasons. So one is that there's this oversaturation right now with not, and when I say that, I'm not at all talking about the people who are doing primarily on in-person work moving to online work. That seems very smart to me. Like every business is doing that, trying to figure out how to take the work that they're already doing and move it online. But but there's also been an influx of people who aren't in the sex industry at all, who've lost their jobs, who are trying to figure out, like, is there a place for them here now? So there's this huge influx of new people who've never done sex work before, who are now on the platforms. And I think that most of the companies like OnlyFans and ManyVids and all of these platforms are saying that they're having these huge spikes in people like customers who are signing up. And I mean, obviously a lot of that probably has to do with being sheltered in place, like not being able to have a lot of interactions with people. So they're looking for, how can I have interactions at home? And sex workers are a good place to turn for that. But it's actually a little more complicated than that. I've been doing interviews of sex workers and asking them how this is impacting their business. One of the things that people have been saying is that they have less time, and that's been my experience too. So my regular clients are sheltering in place with their wives and with their kids, and don't have it, or their roommates even, and don't have a lot of privacy. So it's not as if they're spending a lot of time in like one-on-one interactions in the way that they were before. So lack of privacy, I think, is an issue. There's a lot of economic anxiety, obviously, like across the entire world. So clients who would spend more are like anxious about their financial stability, so they're spending a little less money, which I think is why there's been kind of an influx in subscription sites like OnlyFans or any of the other ones, because those are, $5 a month or $10 a month. They're lower level transactions than talking to somebody on the phone for an hour or doing a Skype session for half an hour or something like that. So there's that, but also I think that the work itself has changed, and I think a lot. I can only speak from my own experience, but I've also heard other models and sex workers say this, that people's anxiety is really high, and they're spending, and there's also a lot of like collective grief, and so the work that we've been doing with our clients is slightly different, in that there's been a lot of emotional labor, a lot more emotional labor, a lot more talking about people's fears, or the fact that they've lost their job, or the fact that they're experiencing people around them or people around them have been having health issues. There's all sorts of things that have changed the landscape of doing sex work right now.
I mean, if it kind of toward that end, one of the folks that I interviewed was saying they normally get paid $500 an hour to do work. They would have, 4 or 5 sessions a week. They had built their kind of life around the type of budget. And now they're working. And again, there was time before the client would come over and after. So it wasn't just an hour, but, but the rate they were able to give people was $500 an hour. And now they're working 8 to 10 hours a day to only make $250 in that day. And trying to balance, like you said, the privacy issues with getting support from the government. What prevents either sex workers or adult entertainers from saying that they're providing counseling services, or they're providing other forms of interaction with a person, so that they don't get categorized in that, like, there's some word that was used.
Yeah. Now I can't remember it either. Yeah, I mean, that's how sex workers pay their taxes, right?
Okay.
Like coming up, but I think I'm a consultant or something. Because we get paid, like, for online sex workers, we get paid by our platform. So all of our all of the money that we earn is taxable. So yeah, so there's a lot of ways in which people do that. They're doing like consulting, or they're doing like arts and entertainment, or whatever, depending on how they categorize things. So yeah, I mean, so long as people prurient, the word is prurient, I think.
Yes. I was like, what the hell and again, I'm not the smartest tool in the shed, but also, like, I've been to school, and I'm like, who even uses words like that? Like, what kind of 1830 vocabulary is that?
Yeah, interestingly, so there's a law group that's been fighting FOSTA SESTA called the Walters Law Group down in Florida. They've been working with the Woodhull Freedom Foundation to fight FOSTA SESTA, which was the major legislation in 2018 that changed that shut down a lot of our internet communications. And so they've been fighting that, but they also put out something recently that said that they believe that the definition of prurient is hard to pin down, and that performers and sex workers could probably fight that because it was like fairly technical what they said, but what they said is something to the effect of, the definition of prurient is that it's a sexual content that's done in some way that's like deviant or
Right.
problematic or something. And they basically said, well, couldn't porn performers, or anybody who's applying for these loans say, well, the way that I do it isn't deviant or problematic or whatever it is that you're going to use that definition for. This is actually a public good. The
Right.
work that we do makes people feel better, and it's, positive in people's lives. And we're actually working to take the shame out of sex, not infuse it back into it. So I don't know. But obviously that hasn't been tested yet, and we don't really know what they mean when they say prurient. So yeah, I mean, I think that there probably are a lot of people who can try to figure out how to work around this. But that being said, I think the fact that there are all these roadblocks that are put up, like for specifically for sex workers, makes sex workers feel very nervous about having any sort of interaction with the government in which they're laying out anything about their business, and I
Right.
think that um, even if um, even if one could technically make a case for something, do you want to make this case? And I think those are important questions to ask. Like, when you feel like you're marginalized and when you feel like you don't have any power or any say, and that your job is either criminalized or deeply stigmatized, because all forms of sex work are deeply stigmatized. There are a lot of barriers to getting uh, moving around these systems.
In the area where you are you finding legislators or folks that work in state or local government that are in any way supportive of sex workers' rights, or any folks at a more national level?
Yeah, I mean, there are people at a national level who are more open to that. I think Julia Salazar up in New York
Right.
is I think that's how you say her name. Yeah, and yes, but I mean, the problem is, so Elizabeth Warren right now is was trying to put together a research project that I think has been mostly tabled right now because of COVID, but to look at the real impacts of FOSTA SESTA post legislation or post it going into law in 2018, to see if the ostensibly like anti-trafficking measures that they put in place that are actually in point of fact anti-sex working legislation, what sort of impact that had. That being said, the reason that FOSTA even went into place was that it was almost unanimously voted into place. It was bipartisan. 98 people in the Senate voted yes for it. Um so in that sense, like, sex workers are pretty pushed out and left aside by politicians. So I don't see a ton of, and part of this I think goes back to the beginning of what we were talking about in terms of feminist feminist critiques. There's a lot of push for anti-sex work legislation from like anti-sex work organizations right now. There's a big thing going on right now actually that's being reported on this week about groups pushing payment processors to no longer do business with porn platforms at all.
Right.
So, um, and I think that, uh, yeah, I,
How how would we, or how would individuals who are advocating be able to distinguish or partition this conversation of, yes, we want to protect children, or yes, we want to
right. Mhm.
protect people who have been victims of human trafficking, but the measures being implemented actually don't stop that and harm other people who are engaged in legal businesses, or not
Right.
so legal
Mhm.
businesses, but it's not involving children and it's not keeping
Right.
people
They're not being
hostage.
trafficked and yeah.
You know,
Yeah, I mean, I think that the only thing that we can do for or the only thing that we can say to this is that we can look to people who are trafficking, who have been trafficked, who and what they'll say is that these laws have actually harmed them. They haven't made it better, and the fact that a lot of I mean, I think that's the best thing. That's the best that we can do, actually, is say we can look at what are the implications of these laws, who's being criminalized, and who's being, who are they being, who's most impacted is the best
right,
way to say that. Who's most impacted, and are people getting help? And the answer to those is the people that are most impacted are the ones that are most vulnerable. Trans folks, people of color, people who, um, and I think that there's uh, what I'm trying to say is that the people who are most impacted are not helped.
right,
And the people who've also been like victims of trafficking or of child porn or all of that have also come out and said that these like harsh laws are not helping. They're actually just pushing things more underground and criminalizing them. And what we have seen is that we've seen a lot of, going back to your notion of like intersectionality, we've seen a lot of people who, like all of the raids on massage parlors, for example, where the idea is, oh, the women who are working in here must be victims of trafficking. They're most often arrested and deported.
right.
They're not being helped. And so I think that looking at how people are being impacted, including the people that these laws are supposed to ostensibly like help, is important because nobody is being helped.
And to that, what is your perspective on the difference between legalization and decriminalization?
Yeah, so most sex workers will say that they are not that they want decriminalization and not like legalization. And the reason for that is that legalization involves like a lot of regulation.
Right,
And the issue is that there's a broken relationship between sex work and the police. And I think that the fear about about legalization is that what one has to do in order to work as like a legal sex worker would be to give all of your information to, this is what happens with legal brothels in Nevada, for example. So in
right,
order to work in a legal brothel, you need to give all of your information to the sheriff. You need to have a sheriff's card, which means that you're registered as a sex worker. You need to go through like various levels of like testing that's regulated from outside of you and your business. And the problem with this is that it is going to create, or it creates, and we've seen this in other places too, a class of sex workers who can do that, who are safe enough to register with the sheriff, who have enough money to pay for all of the like testing and regulation and licensing that you need to have in order to do that job. And then people who can't.
right.
And the people who can't aren't going to are still being criminalized in that sense. And so decriminalization is just stopping criminalizing any form of sex work, stop arresting people for engaging in sex work. And yeah.
Yeah, and that kind of reminds me of what's happened with, legal marijuana, and the idea that
Mhm.
for decades you have people of certain communities that were arrested, are still incarcerated,
Yeah.
and now you have other folks that, because they're from wealthy backgrounds, or
Right.
were already attorneys, they know how to push the paperwork through, and they're able to start their distribution services or grow services, whatever else it is. But
Right.
it's still left a community that suffered
Yeah.
from the quote unquote war on drugs for decades out of the market and out of the new industry.
Right.
Um,
Hmm.
and and I guess, how does this conversation get brought to a larger platform, right? Because like you and I
Hmm.
can talk about it. There are some advocates that I've run across. That's how I've been doing these interviews.
Yeah.
But why is the media avoiding this conversation? Like, why is it when people are doing activists and outreach events, the news isn't showing up? The newspapers aren't writing about it.
Right. Hmm. I think that there has been more interest in sex work in the last year than I've seen before from mainstream media. So I think that there is more and more interest in it. I think going back to what you were saying earlier, though, is that a lot of it is kind of sensational interest too, and that's not helpful to anyone. Um, I think that it comes down to stigma, to not seeing sex workers as people who are worthy of the
Mm.
same like rights and respect as everybody else. And um go and even what you were saying earlier, talking about the fact that people will say things like, "Oh, well, they chose to go into this field, so they're criminals," or um too bad for them if they get assaulted on set or in a session with a client. They shouldn't have done that. I think that there's a lot of stigma, and there's a lot of like slut shaming that goes into perceptions of sex work and perceptions of sex workers. And um, we as like a culture and we as a society need to get over a lot of that
Right.
in order to have real conversations about real people who are doing this work and what sort of impact it has.
Well, for you as an entrepreneur, as a business person, what kind of excites you about running your business? Like, even outside of
Mhm.
the particulars, what do you have a sense of either autonomy or pride in being a business owner or independent, like autonomous worker?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I like the work that I do. I like working in the sex industry. I like my interactions with my clients. Not I mean, obviously, like anything, not every single thing I like, but for the most part, I do feel a lot of pride over having built something. Built my own client base, built a fan base in terms of like my writing and the podcast. Yeah, I do feel that way. What am I excited about? I also have to say that like one of the conditions of my life that makes this make a lot of sense to me is I'm a mom with 3 kids. I'm a mom with 3 kids. I can do all of this work from my house.
Right.
And I haven't had other work that is this flexible. That's this flexible, that allows me to make sure that my kids get to all of the things that they need to get to, that I can kind of be on top of the things that I need to be on top of for them, and then also put in my work like around all of that. And I'm very like fortunate too, because I decided when I started doing this that I was going to, well, I shouldn't say that. It was a long process to get to this place, but at this point in my career, I have things very integrated. So my writing and my video clips and my OnlyFans and my phone lines and everything. I do everything under my Jessie Sage brand. The people who my clients tend to be people who also read all of my articles and listen to my podcast. And so there's a lot of like community around the work that I've done in terms
Right.
of my life. It's very integrated into my life. My husband does work with me too. People know who he is. My fans and clients know who he is, and talk about him and ask about him and stuff. So I've managed to build this thing like that is very integrated into my life.
Right.
And that's really nice, which also means that, I can say very easily to um my clients, oh, it's been really hard during COVID because my kids don't go to school. They're home all day. So I'm going to have to try to like fit you in where I can. And people are really forgiving about that, and so I think that there's um I feel like very fortunate to have something where my life is just kind of going on, because I already before COVID started, for example, I already had this all set up, so
Right.
in terms of, which I know is, not everybody's situation, but I've been at this for a long time now. So I I don't know. It feels very fortunate to me. On the other hand, I made a lot of choices when I did that to accept and live with a lot of stigma and opinions that come
Yeah.
from, other people. So it becomes kind of an insular thing, because people, a lot of people drop away and then you have to build up something like within the sex work community.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting the ways our online lives, our real lives can stay partitioned or overlap
Yeah.
unexpectedly. Like
Mhm.
I do a lot of nude art and
Mhm.
have been in images and have thrown kink parties and play parties and have
Yeah.
a lot of, like, you can find it easily. Like I promote heavy on the internet. It's
Mhm.
not a secret.
Yeah.
And I started working in a high school last year.
Mhm.
And one of the first things is one of my coworkers was like, block everyone from your internet. Like
Yeah.
you need to make your profile private. And I'm like, I can't. I still have to promote what I do.
Yeah, right.
Like I can't really hide any of this stuff. And I don't
Yeah.
work for the Department of Education, so I don't have the same kind of regulations around me.
Yeah.
I'm just kind
Mhm.
of just like outside contractor. But it was this thing that for years as an artist, I didn't have to consider. It was
Yeah.
like, hey, I'm not getting. Whenever like my mom or my aunt or somebody was like, but what if you ever want to get a real job? It's like, hey, remember at 24, I said I wasn't going to be working for other people. At the time, it was like I was 36, and it was like, it's been 12 years. I'm not working for other people. All right, so y'all can relax.
Yeah.
Um, and kind of that multifaceted element of being a human. Like you said,
Yeah.
you had experience as a philosopher. So I want to ask you something about that. What
Yeah.
what was like your favorite theme, or what was something that really excited you about your study of theology and philosophy?
Um, so many things. I think that when I first went to college, I was young, I was like 18, 19. I really fell in love with the idea of education as being this, in Plato. So the first day of college, I should say, the first day I went to community college, I nobody in my family like had it was just a thing that I wanted to do. For I didn't even know why. And my professor talked about the allegory of the cave, which is in Plato. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but Plato talks about being in this like cave and everybody believing that the shadows on the wall were real things. But he talked about like the people who broke out of that and like made this steep and rugged ascent, like up into the light and out of the underground. And there was something about that. And that was like my very first day. And there was something about that that kind of captured my imagination, where I was like, wow, maybe the whole world is bigger than what I think, and there was something that made me want to uh open my world up. That's how I felt. That's how it felt at the beginning. Like it felt like this
Yeah.
opening of new ideas, a more expansive world, bigger ideas. And And then I got into existentialism and into Sartre and this idea that like you build your own world. And it's funny, people don't usually ask me about this, but now that I'm saying this, I'm thinking about having these really early experiences as like a teenager, thinking that I wanted to build a different world and then building it, but in a sex work capacity, which isn't what I anticipated like doing. you know,
Yeah.
um, but yeah, I remember just reading. I remember thinking about the fact that there is no like existentialism says that there is no values from outside of yourself, that you actually have to create those, and that you create that for yourself. And when you make choices as to what's important and what's like not important, or what's valuable and what's not valuable, and that you live those out like through your lives and through your choices. And so I like kind of loved that sort of spirit of creating your world and figuring out what you value. And so when I left because I did this for a long time. I was working in academia for a long time. And then I left because at 36, actually, it's funny that you brought that age up. I'm old. I'm an old sex worker. I I left when I was 35 or 36 because it was also so insular. The opening up that I found at the beginning became narrower and narrower, like
Yeah.
the further along you got. So um it no longer felt open to me. It started to feel like very closed, and also very it was a very hostile environment for a woman.
Yeah.
Philosophy is like notoriously hostile to women. And I had this moment where I was like, well, let's say the best possible outcome came out of this and I got some tenure track job. And I was like, I don't even want that. That would mean that I would have to spend the rest of my life arguing with these like white men about whether I should be in philosophy or not. And I was like, fuck them. I don't want to argue with them. I don't even want to be here. So I just one day like walked out and I was like, I'm done. I'm not doing this with you guys anymore. And then I started working in this industry, and this is so much more open, so much more interesting. The things that I wanted to get out of education, the things I wanted to get out of formal education, um, I didn't get out of. I got some of it, but I've got so much more out of working in this field. It's amazing. The kinds of interactions that we have, the things that people will like talk to us about. I was working a lot before I started this on gender and on masculinity, and um it almost seems like, looking back on it, to be really trivial, the work that academics are doing, because they don't. I feel like when I was doing just only academic work, I didn't have access to um the way people eroticize their experiences, and um I don't know.
This is really interesting. Like, so the thing I was doing in the school last year was introducing an interdisciplinary program to the faculty and staff as well as students,
Mhm.
using existential crisis as the starting point
Oh, really?
and catalyst for learning, and like why you're in
Yeah.
school. Yeah, like
Mhm.
I had gone in and I rap, so like they brought me in
Yeah.
maybe a couple years ago to do rap, and this idea of, well, you're young and black, or I'm not really, I'm like your age probably, if not older. But they're like, you're young and black and do rap music. They'll like that. We did 1 or 2 sessions and the kids started like not really getting interested. And I was like, why don't y'all care? And it turned out a lot of their families weren't from America. And
Yeah.
so they didn't have this attachment to American black music, even though they
Yeah.
looked like me.
Yeah.
And so
That's
we started
interesting. Mhm.
exploring where they were from and their identity. And for them, it was this like fascinating discussion of like, we don't get to talk about our existential identity in school. We
Uh-huh.
don't get to explore the who are we and why and how do we build the world around us.
Yeah.
And it's funny, like I kind of left academia for the same reason. Like I was interested in these conversations to expand, and yet
Yeah.
the farther I went, the more narrow the community of
Yeah.
people I was around was. And I found myself more in like the arts and music community,
Mhm.
which then poured into self-expression, which
Right.
then next thing you know, we're around new performance artists and
Yeah.
kind of this other element.
So interesting. Yeah, your path is like really similar to mine, like in that regard. I
Yeah.
feel um Yeah, I don't know. I just feel like the very sort of intense, like intimate work that I get to do, that I like feel privileged to be able to do in in the sex work that I do now is way more like interesting and deep than what I was doing when I was in academia. And that's also why I said I kind of had to purge, like I had to not write for a couple of years because I felt like my own voice, like through that process, that like training process, got kind of stamped out. And I had to move away from that and kind of figure out who I was outside of all of that. And when I did, I could start writing again, but I was writing from a really different place.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, yeah, I appreciate you coming on. This has been a great conversation. Are there any things you want to leave us with, whether it's how to find you or your writing online or a general sentiment you'd want to tell the world?
A general sentiment. I don't know. Pay sex workers.
So in short, really quickly,
Yeah.
what's your take on things then like Pornhub, where it's like free available pornography for people? Do you
Yeah.
think that is detrimental to the industry?
Yeah, well, it decimated the industry. Yeah, I mean, it drove prices down so low. It also made it much more dangerous for us to do our work in the sense that like we lost access to, or we lost the ability to have some sort of control over where our images are. I mean, it's a platform that's built entirely on piracy. So, um
So
I
again, an outsider would know this. I would
yeah.
assume that there are relationships between that platform, production companies, and workers where people are contributing their content to that site.
It's only started to be that, like, really recently. So if you
Wow.
look at Pornhub now and you'll see, like, the community, people who are part of the, like, Pornhub community, those people have, uploaded videos to Pornhub and are getting a profit share in the same way that, like, YouTube works. But it took a really long time to get there, and every other thing, that's not part of that, the performers aren't getting paid for their content. Most of their content has been ripped off from other sites,
Okay.
and performers feel a lot of pressure now. So the sort of calculus that performers are taking, and I've gone through this myself too and done different things. I've put stuff on Pornhub and then I've pulled it off because I have like this conflict about it that I don't know how to, I haven't quite resolved yet. But the way that a lot of my like colleagues resolve it, and I have a lot of respect for this, is they say, listen, my stuff is up there anyway. Like, I
Right.
don't have any control over that. I may as well create an account and tell Pornhub those videos are mine, so put them under my name so I can at least get something from it. But it's this like really complex relationship where performers have to decide, am I going to try to make money on this platform that actually robbed all of us for so many years? Um, or am I going to just pretend like um yeah, am I just going to try to like stay away from it altogether? And I think that
Right.
there's both of those are bad for performers.
Right. I
There's
mean,
no good solution.
so maybe in a future date, or when things are a bit more settled down and like kind of COVID isn't dominating all the discussions,
Hmm.
one of the things I'd want to talk to people about are the pay balances or imbalances with these services. So like
Hmm.
me personally as an artist, I didn't release my music on Spotify for the past 2 years. I'm in a band. We spent however much money to make our album, and it makes no sense to me that you get paid 0.000% of a
Right.
penny for every
Hmm.
stream. But they can't hear my stuff. And when I meet
Right.
people, they're always like, why can't I hear it? Why can't I hear it? And I'm like, get it live. Like, give me money for a ticket and
Yeah.
come to the show. Or like, if you pay me, I'll send you the record. But there's this equivalence of it's such a monolith. It's so large a platform. And now that I can't do shows live, I have to. We just released it on, oh, by the way, shout out. Parn Hash & Co. is on the internet. You can hear the album, all the platforms. We kind of had to do it. And so even within that, are the pay scales right with OnlyFans? Are the pay scales right with some of
Yeah.
these other entities? And I don't want to badmouth, because people still have to use them. And so
Right.
like, you don't necessarily want to like cause
Yeah.
conflict. But maybe at a later date, we can talk about equity and work and pay
Yeah.
in this industry.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. Yeah. I mean, I think it's something that everyone who works in this industry has to wrestle with. Like, what platforms do I want my stuff to be on? Am I going to go the Pornhub route for the reasons that you're saying? You know, that's where you get a lot of exposure. There's a lot of visibility there. So do you just decide to go with that or try to, you know, put your stuff behind a paywall? So yeah, my stuff is behind a paywall. Not because I think that's a better choice, but because I don't know, you have to make some choice. It's so complicated. There's not like a right choice. I have an OnlyFans at onlyfans.com/sapiotextual, which is my Twitter handle. You can find me on my Twitter handle at sapiotextual. Also have the podcast, Peep Show Podcast, and on Minivids and Night Flirt and Sex Panther. It's pretty easy to find me. I'm just Jessie Sage everywhere. But yeah, I mean, I think that I'm an advocate for paying sex workers. I think it's good for people. I think it's good for us. And also treating sex workers like human beings who add a lot of value and a lot of beauty and a lot of excitement to our lives.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you very much. People, you have been watching Just for My People, my interview series with wonderful creatives and entrepreneurs. My name is Chris Carr. Parnhash is the rap name. Wait, can you see it there? Yeah, that's the rap name, Parnhash. And today's guest was Jessie Sage. Thank you again for coming on. This is awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for having me.
All right. Peace.
Bye.